The other thing that Catherine had was a lot of grief in her family. First losing her father at 5, then eventually her mother. She lost nieces. She lost her best friends. She lost so many young sisters when the community began. And so she was always surrounded by death in so many ways, and that impacted her a great deal. I think it influenced her to be the compassionate woman that she turned out to be through her whole life, and she wanted desperately, I think, to pass that on to the Sisters of Mercy, to those who would follow her. So her life was not easy. So she was raised in a house that was fairly wealthy, and then when her father died, her mother squandered the money. Her mother eventually died. So she and her siblings were left to the care of relatives, and they had to separate, and she went to a particular relative, her brothers went, and her sister went to another relative, and she wound up with non-Catholic relatives, and this was very difficult for her. And so she went from house to house. She was like a foster child in today's terms, you would say. So finally, when she was about in her 20s, she was asked by a family who knew the relatives of her she was living with if she could come and manage their house, be there like a servant almost. And so she did that. She went to the Callahan family, and they did not have any children. They were Quakers. They were very generous. They were very wealthy. And so she began to manage the house there and cared for their affairs when they would travel. And they eventually got elderly and sick. And Mrs. Callahan died first, and then Mr. Callahan was left with Catherine. She always had this vision of connecting the rich with the poor. And so she began immediately, when she inherited the money, to build a house in a very plush neighborhood. Now, you can imagine how that was, bringing the poor into a rich neighborhood. So people called it Kitty's Folly. They called her Kitty. And they said that it wasn't going to, why is she doing this? Why is she spending all this money? But she had a vision of bringing the women and children off the streets, and that's what she did.
She was to use the word in a different sense, she was a charismatic leader. She inspired people to be the best that they could be, to want to do more. So yes, convent life had its rules, but Catherine didn't lead by rules. She led by example and by the encouragement of others. And I think that that's a gift that also helped draw women to the congregation and inspire their dispersal to other parts of the world.
I think Catherine Macaulay was a remarkable individual. I mean, you can hear, depending on who you talk to, you hear wonderful stories about her. She was a woman who held on to her faith at a time when there was pressure to not. I think she was a woman dedicated to her faith who saw a need to serve women and children in Ireland. And she wasn't unique in this, but she had the strength of personality and of mind to know she needed to establish a religious congregation to do what she wanted to do the work as she saw God calling her to do.
Catherine Macaulay's vision was that women their status needed to be raised. They needed to know how to get employment so that they could care for their children and themselves. And so her idea was that starting academies for women would be the way that we could get women educated, and then they would become independent, and they would be able to have employment and have a dignity that was needed by women at that time.
Bishops in different parts of Ireland and then in England, those two countries while Catherine Macaulay was still alive, wanted to have sisters come and help work with the poor in their areas, start schools, maybe open a hospice or a hospital or look after orphans or do those things which they saw that their people were in need of, and they needed, the bishops wanted to respond to those needs and saw the Sisters of Mercy as a way to do that. So that led to expansion, and there were a lot of women joining the convent in those years, and so there were sisters, they could divide, as Catherine Macaulay would say, well, we'll divide with you. So you take 3 and go off and start a new convent in this new town. And then when you grow and get large, you send some people out somewhere else where they're asking. And that's how they came to the United States as well.
Well, she was requested by Catherine Macaulay, the foundress of the Sisters of Mercy, to come because there were requests from bishops in the United States to come. And that was why we came to Chicago, because Bishop Porter, the first bishop here, inquired for the Sisters of Mercy to be able to come here.
She's seeing there are people who need education. She sees that there are people who need shelter, who need food, clothing, what have you. And she and her sisters are trying to be with those people. And so in some ways, if you think about how sisters today want to be with the poor, be with those who are experiencing injustice, that's very much in the same mindset, I think.
We became one of the first congregations that were known as sisters who could go out among the people. In the early days of religious life, sisters were in cloisters, or they just prayed, and they worked for their own upkeep internally, usually with gardens and selling things that they made or grew. And here, the Walking Sisters had a special permission from the Vatican to begin an order that would be among the people. And actually, Catherine Macaulay did that even before she became a sister. And it was the magisterium of the church, the bishops, who said, you're already living and working like nuns, why don't you just become one? And so that's eventually what had happened. And we got the term walking because they saw us walking among the people. We have a very interesting history because there were 5 sisters who were brought here by Francis Ward, and they were all under the age of 24. And the oldest was the 24-year-old, and that was Agatha O'Brien. And you know that one of the dorms is named after her, actually, the O'Brien dorm. But she came, and these 5 sisters actually turned Chicago upside down in the ways that were needed. For example, she started the Catholic school system while she was here. She also started the first Mercy Hospital, orphanage, and so she was very engaged and well needed. And during that time, she lived for 5 years and died of cholera, as did many of them. Agatha O'Brien began the Catholic school system, began schools all over. The academy was the forerunner of St. Xavier University. That was begun, and it was only for women in its inception. Later, in 1966, of course, we invited men to come. And so those were the various things that she began. Again, healthcare and education, the biggest needs. And of course, always in the context of faith. Most of it was, they were poor, The money that built Bagot Street didn't sustain them for beyond that. So most poverty, just like everybody else. So they depended on other people. They depended on the little bit that they got for educating, children. And because they were educating poor, they didn't get very much money. I think it greatly influenced it. The building was destroyed, but no one was injured or killed in that, which was the biggest blessing of all that the sisters were most grateful for, that no one was hurt. And so they had to start all over again, and that's what was the first reason for the move to 49th and Cottage Grove. And so it was then and there that they'd begin again. And fortunately, the sisters always had people who cared about them, who wanted to support the institution, and contributed.